New farming methods and successes for farmers in the post-Civil War era. Why are new farming methods needed? Well, these new conditions that farmers are facing now on the Great Plains and out west required new tools and new techniques. For example, barbed wire. Barbed wire is an innovation in the post-Civil War era that's very important to farmers, and it's really needed because there is a lack of wood on the Great Plains. In the Midwest, in the Old South, there were plenty of trees to cut down and make split rail fences to keep your livestock penned in. But out on the Great Plains, that lack of wood needs some sort of innovation. Barbed wire is that innovation. The lack of rainfall, the arid climate on the Great Plains. Remember, this area was good for growing grasses, and that was about it. Requires a new farming technique, and that new farming technique was dry farming. Essentially, what farmers would do is loosen the soil to slow down evaporation. That's going to allow farmers to grow crops like corn and wheat on the plains. However, it's going to have some long-term consequences that we'll talk about when we get to around the 1930s. New crops are needed to grow in this climate as well. So farmers imported different species or different varieties of wheat from Eastern Europe, where the climate was actually very similar. And so the wheat varieties that were growing in abundance in the Ukraine and Poland and Western Russia were very successful on the American Great Plains. Now, these types of wheat were hardier. They have a more sturdy shell around the part of the wheat that needs to come out in the milling process. So they needed to start using new milling methods to extract the nutrients from that wheat crop as well. There are also some other new technologies, many of which are improvements on old technologies. We see better plows and better tools used for loosening the soil and for planting seeds, and then better tools for harvesting time as well. A couple of notable ones are the baling press and the cord binding harvesters that were used on farmers to make harvest time easier and more efficient. The result of these improvements is that more land can be farmed with fewer people, and that means for lower costs. Now, in the post-Civil War era, there are a lot of political effects, but the biggest, the most profound effects of the post-Civil War era are the effect on the national government's economic powers. We really go from laissez-faire to laissez-faire no more. The government is outright supporting business and outright supporting agriculture, and they do that through a variety of means. There's the Homestead Act, which gives free land, or virtually free land, to American families that want to farm out west. We have huge chunks of land turned over to railroad companies for the construction of transcontinental railroads. One that we haven't talked about yet, the Morrill Land Grant Act, gives big chunks of land to any state that is willing to build a university that teaches agricultural science as one of its subjects. They can teach anything else, but as long as they teach agricultural science, then states can get federal land for free to build a college. This is what leads to the Ohio State University. This is what leads to the University of Illinois and Indiana and Michigan and almost every Big Ten school, as well as all those other dots you see on that map there. We also have a national banking system we've talked about that creates a stronger, more stable national economy, and farmers are going to benefit from that as well. Farmers are also going to benefit from the growing farming machinery business. It's big business. By 1890, there were 900 corporations that were making tools and machines for use on the farm. And farmers are also going to benefit from farming becoming more scientific. One of the people leading the way in this field is Professor Samuel Johnson. He writes two important books of the time. In 1868, How Crops Grow, and in 1870, How Crops Feed. And this is really going to lead to more widespread use of fertilizer. That's only going to make farming even more efficient. And in 1887, the federal government increased their support of scientific agriculture by giving free federal land grants, again, to states that would be willing to build agricultural experimental stations. Oftentimes, these work in conjunction with universities that might have been built under the Morrill Land Grant Act. But if states promise to build these agricultural experiment stations where they're going to try to perfect more scientific farming, they can get free lands. What this leads to is widespread distribution of books like Professor Samuel Johnson's important books for farmers, and the reports that come out of these scientific stations. They're going to peak at 350,000 readers annually. That's a lot of farmers getting the latest information on farming. The best example of the growth and explosion of the farming business and scientific farming can be seen in the bonanza farms that peak in the late 1880s. These are giant farms, think factory farms, that are going to use the latest in machinery. They're going to be funded by investors, oftentimes investors back east. Now, Oliver Dalrymple is the most famous bonanza farm owner. He owned a few in the Dakotas. He would use some of the same techniques that we talked about the other captains of industry using. He bought his materials wholesale. He got rebates from railroad companies. Unfortunately, in about 1885 to 1890, droughts in the upper Great Plains really killed these bonanza farms. And smaller farmers are more flexible and can survive these hard times while many of the bonanza farms go bankrupt. Let's talk about successes next. By 1890, the American West is producing the food for the nation. In California, they're growing enough fruit and wine to feed the country. Texas is raising the beef to feed the country. And the northern plains, with that hardier type of wheat imported from Eastern Europe, using dry farming techniques and all the other innovations we talked about, the northern plains are providing the wheat to make the bread to feed the rest of the country. Heck, even Utah, after irrigation is introduced, becomes productive. That arid Great Basin region out west is a productive farming area. All this leads to falling food prices for Americans. In fact, by 1890, America is producing so much food that we begin exporting large amounts. Americans can't eat it all. Some other changes for the farmer: farming becomes more commercial. Farming is much more linked to the business cycles and the markets up and downs that other industries face. And farming becomes more scientific. As farmers know more, it becomes more of a scientific craft. Fortunately, farmers also become more connected to the rest of the United States. That isolation that used to plague farmers is not as much of a problem anymore as a result of things like rural free delivery, started by the Sears and Roebuck Corporation, followed by other companies, where farmers using a catalog could order any of the modern conveniences enjoyed by Americans living in the city, and they could have those delivered to them for free.